During the American Civil War, the summer of 1862 witnessed the Confederacy having success in the Eastern Theater and far less than spectacular results in the West. In the East, Robert E. Lee and the newly named Army of Northern Virginia had repulsed George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac during the 7 Days battles, and Lee was beginning his first invasion of the North. However, Confederate forces in the West had lost Forts Henry and Donelson in northwestern Tennessee, with over 10,000 much-needed troops, and had been defeated in April at the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, otherwise known as the Battle of Shiloh Church, resulting in well over 1,000 Confederates killed, including the Confederacy's overall commander in the West, Kentuckian Albert Sidney Johnston. B.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter and First Manassas, took over the Confederate forces but was forced to abandon the vital railroad hub of Corinth, Mississippi, and retreated southward. This left nearly all of Tennessee and northern Mississippi in federal control. Confederate generals Braxton Bragg, replacing Beauregard as commander of the Army of Mississippi, and Edwin Kirby Smith, commander of the Department of East Tennessee, soon to be known as the Army of Kentucky, met on July 31, 1862 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, to devise a plan while there was still time for a brilliant summer campaign to rid Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, and Kentucky of the federal occupiers. Bragg, with 30,000 men, would quickly bypass federally occupied Nashville and march into west-central Kentucky, thereby cutting Federal Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio's supply lines, while Kirby Smith's 23,000 soldiers would advance into the east-central region of the Bluegrass State, placing a significant enemy force to Buell's left flank. Kirby Smith, a Florida native, educated at West Point, left for Kentucky from Knoxville on August 17th. Concerned with the well-entrenched but poorly supplied federal garrison of 10,000 troops on his right flank at Cumberland Gap, Smith dispatched Brigadier General Carter Stevenson with 9,000 troops to keep those federal troops in check. Meanwhile, Smith's other 3 divisions slowly made their way through the drought-stricken mountains of southern Kentucky. Meanwhile, Federal Major General Don Carlos Buell had received word of the impending invasion and sent Major General William Bull Nelson to Louisville to see to the defenses of that important supply-laden city and to meet and repel any Confederate invasion of Kentucky. Nelson, a 37-year-old native of Maysville, Kentucky, U.S. Naval Academy graduate, and Mexican War veteran, took the command with his usual vigor, only to find the troops available for the defense of Kentucky to be very inexperienced men, only recently mustered into the service from the states of Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, with sections of Michigan artillery. Most hadn't been in the service more than 3 weeks. Nelson had the command with the men he was given. Not completely sure of Kirby Smith's intentions, Nelson sent 2 brigades under Brigadier Generals Mahlon Manson and Charles Cruft to Lexington, and then on to Richmond with 7,000 men, with orders not to bring about an engagement without surety of success. In the interim, Kirby Smith's Confederate cavalry commander, Colonel John Scott, and his 900 troopers, mostly from Louisiana, reached Big Hill on August 23rd and routed the Federal 7th Kentucky Cavalry under Colonel Leonidas Metcalf. Scott did not pursue the Federals due to the appearance of Federal infantry in Richmond arriving from Lexington. Using the main north-south route, known as the Old State Road, Kirby Smith's lead infantry units crossed Big Hill on August 28th and moved into the Madison County and Bluegrass region. Captain Alfred T. Fletcher of the 12th Tennessee recounted, "We pretty soon commenced ascending a very rough high mountain. The road was quite rough most of the way, and what was not rocky and rough was shoe-deep in loose sand." Private Thompson of Douglas, Texas Artillery Battery said, "The country is mountainous and sparsely settled, and poor people who have but little to subsist any army on. We are now short of rations." Kirby Smith's 4th Division commander, Brigadier General Patrick Cleburne, was in the lead, and he moved his men all night over Big Hill, with Brigadier General Thomas Churchill following with the 3rd Division. Kirby Smith's other divisional commanding officer, Brigadier General Henry Heth, was a good day's march south from the other 2 divisions. Claiborne, a 34-year-old Irish immigrant with extensive experience in the English Army and hailing from Arkansas, was a veteran of Shiloh, where he showed great talent and was the most experienced of Kirby Smith's divisional commanders. Churchill, a Jefferson County, Kentucky native, served as postmaster of Little Rock and fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. Claiborne moved his men within sight of Bobtown, just south of the village of Kingston, when word reached him of Federal forces just north of the small village of Kingston. Colonel John Scott and his cavalry had a rough scrap with the Federal infantry at an area known as Muddy Creek, or Rogersville, a little over a mile or so north of Kingston, and were being pursued by Federal cavalry. Scott lost a mountain howitzer in that conflict, but led the unsuspecting Federals into a snare set by Claiborne's infantry at Joe's Lick Knob after dark on the night of the 29th. Casualties were very light on both sides, but the Confederates did retrieve 30 breech-loading Wesson carbines found in the road strewn with other equipment. Aware of the fight at Muddy Creek, Federal Commander Mahlon Manson sent word to Major General Bull Nelson at Lexington, informing him that Confederates had crossed Big Hill in force. Nelson immediately sent, by courier, a reply back to Manson not to risk an engagement, but to move Manson's force to Lancaster. Unfortunately for Manson and the Federals at Richmond, the message came too late. The stage had been set for confrontation. At 4 a.m. on Saturday, August 30th, 1862, dawn had broken, clear and cool, but promised to be very hot. The region was in a terrible drought, and both man and animal wanted for water. Union Brigadier General Manson roused his troops, bivouacked at Rogersville, just north of Kingston. At 4:30 a.m., just as the first rays of the hot summer day dawned, Kirby Smith issued orders to Patrick Claiborne to move his divisions north from Bobtown and expect a meeting with the Federals around Kingston. Claiborne moved his division north up the Old State Road toward Kingston. Claiborne's cavalry pickets ran into Union cavalry pickets at the Crooksville-Lancaster Road intersection with the Old State Road at 5 a.m., forcing the Federals back after a sharp exchange. Receiving word of the cavalry skirmish, Manson sent word to his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles Cruft, who was still in Richmond, to bring his brigade to Rogersville as quickly as possible. Manson marched from Rogersville toward Kingston looking for the Confederates. They would soon find them. Confederate cavalry scouts reported to Claiborne that Federal forces were in line of battle just south of a small brick church known as Mount Zion. Claiborne rode forward to get the view for himself. Manson had positioned 3 regiments on, from what Claiborne's point of view, the right of Old State Road, and 1 on the left, with artillery in support a little way south of Mount Zion Church. Claiborne immediately sent for his infantry and artillery to come up. He placed Douglas's 1st Texas Artillery Battery on a high ridge just north of the village, within a mile of the Union position. At 7 a.m., Manson ordered his 8 guns of Michigan artillery to open fire on the approaching Confederates. Confederate Colonel Benjamin Hill: "The enemy commenced a heavy artillery fire upon our line in the village." Soon, Douglas's 4 guns were in position and answering the Federals. Sam Thompson: "We opened on the enemy with our 4 guns, 2 12-pound howitzers under 1st Lieutenant James Bourne, and 2 6-pound guns under 2nd Lieutenant John Bingham. The enemy turned all their artillery promptly on us. They had much higher ground and appeared well sheltered in their position. The infantry lay down to our left and rear, out of the danger of the enemy's guns, and the music of the 2 batteries rose to the grandeur of battle. Shells burst with great force about us, and their solid shot shrieked close to our heads with fearful accuracy. Federal artilleryman Lieutenant Byron Paddock said Confederate shot and shell began falling all around us like rain. Confederate artillery fire struck the Mount Zion Church during the fusillade. Knowing a battle was about to begin, Union surgeons set up a hospital in and around Mount Zion Church in anticipation of the coming tempest. After the 2-hour artillery duel, it was now the infantry's turn. Cleburne's division of Tennesseans and Arkansans began moving up the right side of the old state road and engaged the Union left. But Cleburne and Kirby Smith had a little surprise for the Federals. They instructed Brigadier General Thomas Churchill to take his division west of the Crooksville-Lancaster Pike, about a half mile to a ravine that traveled north along a creek known as Mound Branch, and most importantly, completely out of the Federals' line of sight. While Manson was becoming heavily engaged on his left, a near knockout punch was sneaking up on his right. Sometime during this action, Cleburne was severely wounded in the mouth and jaw, and command of his division delved to Preston Smith. Manson, sensing his left flank was about to be turned, ordered most of the 69th Indiana Infantry Regiment to support other troops on the left side of the road, leaving only 3 companies on the right. These men witnessed nearly 3,000 Confederates, mainly from Texas and Arkansas, converge on their position from what is now known as Churchill's Draw. After a very short stand, these companies of the 69th Indiana, probably no more than 200 men at most, broke, and the right flank of Manson's line collapsed. General Cruft had now arrived on the field. On a rise half-mile north of the Mount Zion Church sat the stately home of Adam Rogers, known as the Rogers House. As Manson and Cruft tried to stabilize the Union lines, this dwelling became a rallying and reorganization point for the battered Federals, whose wounded now packed the Mount Zion Church and Rogers House. Just after the first shot of the battle, Mount Zion Church became a hospital, and remained so for several weeks, even suffering artillery damage to the south side. Knowing that the Federal forces were greatly demoralized and had taken great loss of life, Manson ordered the Federals to retreat to the crossroads of Old State Road, Duncannon Lane, and Speedwell Road, about a half mile north of the Rogers House. Here, the Federals would form a second line. Major General Bull Nelson, now in Lancaster, and not aware that the battle had commenced, heard the continuous artillery fire to the east and immediately set out for Richmond via Paint Lick on the Garrett-Madison County border. The Confederates, being hungry and tired from their several days' march and the morning's heavy battle, did not actively pursue the Federals. After a short respite, the Confederates moved upon the Federal second battle line. The battle for Senator White's farm had begun. Cruft's brigade formed the far right flank of the Union line. Hoping to thwart the Confederate advance as they came upon another mansion known as Cumberland View, these Federal regiments moved forward and entered a whirlwind of Texas lead. Those Federal units were severely bloodied and forced back, and the entire Union force retired in poor order for Richmond. The battle for Senator White's farm ended about 1:30 in the afternoon on an unrelentingly hot August day. An eerie silence descended over the battlefield, pierced at times by the screams and moans of the dying and wounded. Both Confederate and Union commanders plotted what to do next. Federal troops were greatly depleted by battle and heat, and the Confederates likewise. But momentum is definitely on the southern side. As the first of the Confederate troops came in sight of Richmond, they heard a rousing cheer go up from the retiring Federals. General Bull Nelson had arrived on the field. Finding the Federal force resembling a mob instead of an army, Nelson proceeded to form a third and ultimately final line on a rise just east of the city, in front of a large, stately mansion known to the locals as Holloway House. On this rise rested the dead of Richmond in the city cemetery. Here, Nelson positioned his troops in hopes of fending off the Confederate advance until he could possibly evacuate his forces under the cover of darkness. Lieutenant James Cox of the 16th Indiana noted, "There was only a shadow of hope." Entering the outskirts of Richmond, Captain Paul Hammond of Kirby Smith's staff noted, "We found the enemy's encampment, deserted by all but a few wounded men and the surgeons attending them." Proceeding further toward the city, another Confederate noted, "They had the prettiest line of battle I ever saw. It was formed in a grove of forest trees behind a fence. Their center was on the outer edge of the town cemetery and commanded a view of 800 yards. Not waiting for his artillery to come up, Kirby Smith deployed his battle-weary forces on either side of the road entering the town, and moved forward into the Federal line, which was mainly to the south of the turnpike. As the Confederates exited a large cornfield, very tall and a full ear, the Union line fired a wicked volley into them. The Confederate advance slowed due to the stiffness of Union resistance, fences, and very difficult terrain. Captain John Lavender of the 4th Arkansas remembers a number of company officers of the regiment, myself, went over the fence, being in front of our company. But when the men struck the fence, they turned in a full volley at the enemy. I had to back myself up in the lock of rails and stand at a post facing the enemy, and a perfect sheet of fire passing through the fence on both sides of me. Colonel Benjamin Hill said, "As we cleared a rise in the ground, the deadliest fire was poured into us that had occurred all day. And although the bullets hailed, our brave troops did not falter." A Federal account reads, "The Confederates reached a level clover field in front of our center when they received a volley deliberately aimed from behind our shelter. Without halting to return fire and with arms at right shoulder shift, the veterans of a dozen battles pulled their hats closer over their brows, closed up their ranks, and pressed on, with lines dressed as on parade." There was something appalling in the steady tramp of their approach that carried terror in the heart of many a man whose first experience of this was under fire. Sergeant Henry Phelps of the 95th Ohio later recounted, "We fired briskly as the enemy advanced, but they did not scare worth a cent." As the Confederate fire increased in its intensity, the Federal right flank collapsed and broke. Finally, the entire Federal line collapsed from south to north, sending the Federal soldiers skedaddling through the cemetery and into the streets of Richmond and beyond. An Indiana corporal said, "We were forced to give way, which we did with more speed than grace." Even General Nelson himself, by now, had received a wound in the fleshy part of his left thigh, but remained on the field angrily chiding the troops as cowards. Despite Nelson's continued attempts to rally his men, the rout was on. The main street of Richmond quickly became a morass of men, horses, wagons, equipment, and ambulances. But the Confederate leaders had another surprise for the retreating Federals. Earlier in the day, Kirby Smith had ordered Confederate Cavalry Commander Colonel John Scott to execute a wide flanking maneuver to the west, in order to possibly cut off any potential routes of escape of the Federal Army. Now, with the Federals in full retreat and heading out of Richmond towards the Kentucky River, the Confederate cavalry can lie in wait. With few shots fired, nearly the entire remnants of the retreating Army of the Blue were captured en masse just north of the city. Bull Nelson was able to sidestep the Confederate trap and make it north. Some of the Union boys took another route north and made it to Winchester. Cruft made it to Winchester, but Manson was moderately wounded when his horse fell on him, and he was taken prisoner. The Confederate victory was now complete, and the road north to Lexington was virtually cleared of any organized Federal resistance. But now Kirby Smith had a problem. Over 4,000 Federal prisoners he was not planning on. Most of the Federal captured were kept in a makeshift stockade constructing a fine ornamental fence that surrounded the Madison County Courthouse, the very same courthouse still in use today. And that fence is the exact same closure that lines East Main Street in front of the Richmond Cemetery, the very same cemetery that witnessed such furious fighting late in the day. Over the next few days, the Federal prisoners were paroled or set free with conditions at the Mount Pleasant Mansion overlooking Richmond. Most churches, schools, and many private residences became hospitals for the well over 1,000 wounded, both blue and gray. And the medical personnel of both sides, along with local residents and their slaves, began the task of burying the dead. Commenting on the treasure trove of supplies and equipment now in Confederate hands, one Texas soldier said, "Here I saw how they were being fed. Canned fruits of all kinds, condensed milk, first I ever saw, cheese, and other edibles. They also had large quantities of clothing, shoes, bats, pants, all of which we put to good use. We were nearly naked. The pants I wore, coat I had not, were made of some thin material, and my canteen, haversack, and belt had worn holes on both sides, and in a short time they would not have held together. I confiscated a pair of blue pants, a gray army shirt, and a pair of excellent shoes, and hung my old ones out on a fence. Several of Kirby Smith's commands were able to rendezvous with Braxton Bragg and participated in the largest battle fought on Kentucky soil, the Battle of Perryville. The Battle of Richmond caused several events to occur. The Battle of Richmond resulted in Confederate troops occupying Lexington and the state capital at Frankfort, the only time a Union state capital fell during the entire Civil War. Lead elements of Kirby Smith's force reached as far north as Florence, Kentucky, causing panic in Cincinnati, some 10 miles away. The Battle of Richmond is the only example of Federal force ceasing to exist at the end of the fight. Basically, Nelson's entire command was either killed, wounded, or captured. All of the Union artillery, stores, equipment, and surviving animals were captured and put to good use by the Confederates. Total Union casualties were 206 killed, 844 wounded, and 4,303 captured or missing. Confederate losses were reported less fully, but is generally accepted to be 122 killed, 519 wounded, and 3 captured or missing. Not all Confederate units reported their losses. Most of the Union dead after the Battle of Richmond were originally interred in the Richmond Cemetery, but in 1867 were reinterred in the new Camp Nelson National Cemetery in Jessamine County. Most of the Confederate dead are buried in a mass grave in the Richmond Cemetery, with a few buried at the base of Big Hill near the ruins of the Merritt Jones Tavern, with still others buried at Big Hill, Berea Cemetery, and Lancaster Cemetery.